The streets of Athens, on a spring morning, smelled faintly of olive oil and smoke from the bakeries. Children darted between doorways, their laughter carrying over the low hum of merchants at the agora. Among them, a girl, no more than 9, balanced a clay jug against her hip. Her bare feet were dusted white from the stone road, her tunic falling to her knees. She moved quickly, keeping her eyes lowered, for she had already learned that the world was not hers to claim. In ancient Greece, to be born female was to inherit a set of boundaries so tight they seemed invisible until you tried to push against them. The moment of birth determined a girl's place in the order of things, an heir if male, a burden if female. Fathers greeted daughters with restrained acceptance, sometimes even disappointment, unless she could be married advantageously. Infant exposure, though rare among citizens compared to slaves or the poor, was not unknown. Unwanted girls were the most vulnerable. For those who survived, childhood would be brief and innocence fragile. In Athens, law and custom dictated that a woman could not own property, could not vote, could not represent herself in court. From cradle to grave, her identity was tethered to a kurios, a male guardian, first her father, then her husband, and later her son if widowed. She was, in legal terms, a permanent minor. These rules were not merely written in law, they were embedded in the rhythm of life, reinforced by ritual and expectation. Yet the Greek world was not monolithic. In Sparta, far to the south, the rules bent into different shapes. Spartan girls, unlike their Athenian counterparts, were expected to train in running, wrestling, and discus throwing. They were fed well, taught to sing war songs, and spoke more freely in public. Their freedom, however, was not born from a belief in equality, it was calculated, a method to produce strong mothers for future soldiers. Strength, like beauty in Athens, was still measured by what it could give to the state. In Athens, the girl with the jug would spend her youth in her mother's shadow, learning the arts of the household, spinning wool into thread, weaving cloth, mixing perfumes, preparing bread. She would learn the subtle language of obedience, how to speak only when addressed, how to sit in silence during her father's discussions, how to make herself small in the company of men. She might catch glimpses of her father's world through the narrow courtyard gate, the philosophers in the agora debating justice, the rhapsodes reciting Homeric verse, but those ideas were not for her. Marriage was the horizon her life moved toward. Not love, not self-discovery, but the exchange of her person in the interest of alliance and property. The thought of this future would not be framed in romantic terms. It would be spoken of in whispers between mothers and daughters. He is a good man, he will provide, he will protect you. It was an unbroken chain of transactions disguised as care. Beneath these customs lay a quiet cruelty. The state celebrated its democracy, yet half the population lived in political invisibility. The plays of Aristophanes and Euripides occasionally mocked or questioned women's place, but mostly their voices were filtered through the mouths of men. The philosophers debated virtue and justice in grand terms, while never imagining that these applied equally to the girl carrying water home from the well. The young in Athens learned early the value of conformity. Girls were praised for their modesty, for staying indoors, for avoiding the gaze of strangers. The home was their universe, its walls both protection and prison. Their existence was woven into the tapestry of the oikos, the household, and to step outside its weave was to risk being unraveled entirely. And so, from the moment of her first steps, a girl in ancient Greece was not only walking but being led, toward a life already mapped out, toward an adulthood chosen for her before she could read or write her own name. The girl with the clay jug would grow, and soon enough, her childhood would vanish like dust washed from her feet after a long walk through the streets of Athens. Her story was already written in the language of her society, though she did not yet know it. If a girl in ancient Greece was lucky enough to survive the dangers of infancy, disease, malnutrition, and, for the poorest, abandonment. Her childhood would pass in a blink. The Greeks did not see childhood as a protected season of life to be stretched out with play and education. It was a short, narrow bridge between birth and the responsibilities of womanhood. By the age of 5, an Athenian girl was already assisting her mother or nurse with household tasks. She learned to grind barley into flour, stir boiling lentils without burning herself, and keep the fire alive in the hearth, the heart of the home, sacred to the goddess Hestia. Her small hands practiced holding a distaff, twisting raw wool into long, fine threads. Mistakes were met not with patience but with correction, for these skills were not hobbies. They were survival. Her days unfolded within the dim rooms of the gyneconitis, the women's quarters, where sunlight came only in thin shafts through narrow windows. Here she heard the murmur of women's voices, her mother's, perhaps a grandmother's, and those of servant girls or slaves. Their conversations, though often practical, carried stories of childbirth pains, of marriages made and broken, of sons sent to war and never returned. A girl absorbed these tales without question. They were not warnings, but inevitabilities. Play, when it existed, was not separate from preparation. Dolls carved from wood or fashioned from rags were dressed in miniature chitons, mimicking the life ahead. Games with pebbles, knucklebones tossed into the air, taught dexterity that would be useful for sewing and weaving. There were no scrolls of philosophy for her, no arithmetic beyond what was needed for managing stores of grain or oil. If she belonged to a wealthy family, her confinement was stricter. Wealth meant more to lose, reputation, alliances, so the daughters of the elite were guarded carefully. They might not even fetch water from the public fountain, a rare glimpse of the street life that poorer girls could still claim. If she were from a farming family in the countryside, her world might be broader, helping in the fields, tending goats, carrying baskets of figs to the market. But even there, she was expected to stay close to home, her movements watched. This seclusion had a cost beyond boredom. Many girls grew up knowing little of the city that would dictate their lives. The Parthenon's marble steps, the philosophers' debates in the Stoa, the theaters where tragedies unfolded, these were places she might never see except on a festival day, and even then from the edges of the crowd, veiled and silent. The contrast with boys was stark. By the age of 7, boys began formal education, learning letters, numbers, music, and the art of public speech. They were groomed to become citizens, decision-makers, voices in the assembly. Girls, on the other hand, were groomed to disappear, at least in the public sense, until they emerged on the arm of a husband chosen for them. One of the few public occasions where girls were seen and celebrated was during religious festivals, and even then their visibility served a purpose. They might be selected as a referoi, young girls chosen to weave a new robe for the goddess Athena, or as kenephoroi, basket-bearers in the Panathenaic procession. These roles were honors, but also advertisements, proof that the girl came from a respectable family and was ready to be noticed by potential suitors. In these moments, she might glimpse the larger world, the marketplace, the sea of faces, the Acropolis towering above. But the day would end, and she would return to her shadowed quarters, her public presence fading again into private duty. Childhood in ancient Greece for a girl was not measured in years, but in tasks mastered and duties assumed. By 12, sometimes earlier, she was no longer a child in the eyes of her community. She was a maiden, an object of negotiation, a future wife, and soon after, a mother. The brevity of that childhood meant that many girls never had the space to imagine themselves as anything beyond the role assigned to them. Their innocence, such as it was, belonged not to them, but to the society that kept them enclosed, untouched, unvoiced, and unprepared for the weight of the life that awaited. For many girls in ancient Greece, the shadow of marriage fell long before they reached what we would now consider adolescence. In the eyes of their families, they were not individuals to be courted in their own time, but assets to be placed strategically, like precious pieces in a political game. Marriage was less about love than it was about survival, of family honor, wealth, and alliances. Betrothals could be arranged when a girl was as young as 7 or 8, sometimes even younger. The agreement might be sealed with a handshake between her father and her future husband, a man often decades her senior. The girl herself had no legal voice in the matter. In Athens, she was under the Kyrios, the male guardian, usually her father, who had full authority to decide her fate. In wealthier households, the betrothal was a calculated maneuver. A powerful merchant might offer a generous dowry in exchange for marrying into an aristocratic lineage, lifting his children into a higher social stratum. A father might promise his daughter to an influential politician, hoping the alliance would shield his family from rivals. In poorer families, the motives were simpler but no less pressing. Marrying a daughter meant one less mouth to feed, and perhaps the chance for her to live with more security than her natal home could provide. The age gap could be shocking. A girl of 12 might be promised to a man in his 40s, who had already buried a wife and sired children older than his new bride-to-be. To the men, such unions made practical sense. Young wives were more likely to bear healthy children and less likely to bring with them past entanglements. But for the girls, the prospect was daunting, a leap into a life they could neither choose nor refuse. The betrothal itself was marked by rituals that cloaked the transaction and religious solemnity. Offerings might be made to Artemis, goddess of maidenhood, asking for a smooth transition into married life. Friends and relatives might visit, bearing gifts of jewelry or finely woven cloth, tokens that were as much about displaying the family's status as celebrating the girl's future. Yet beneath the ceremonial gloss was the unspoken knowledge: she was being transferred, like property, from one male guardian to another. Dowry negotiations were central to the process. The dowry, money, land, slaves, or goods, was the father's contribution to the new household, intended to ensure his daughter's upkeep. In theory, it offered her some protection. If she were mistreated or divorced, the dowry could be returned to her family. In practice, it was a bargaining chip, a silent reminder that her worth could be measured in drachmas and acres. Once betrothed, a girl's life often tightened further. She might be shielded from public view more strictly, her education in domestic arts intensified. Her mother or female relatives would teach her the finer points of managing a household, overseeing servants, keeping accounts, preserving food stores for winter. Every lesson reinforced the same truth: her value lay in her ability to maintain the honor and efficiency of her future husband's home. Emotionally, the betrothal could be bewildering. A child who had barely begun to understand her own body was suddenly treated as a woman in waiting. The conversations around her shifted, no longer about childish games or household chores, but about her future husband's family, his property, his reputation. If she felt fear or reluctance, there was no forum for voicing it. The notion that a girl might reject a match was almost unthinkable. Disobedience could bring disgrace not just on her, but on her entire family. There were exceptions, rare stories of girls whose fathers delayed their marriages out of affection or who married for love, but these were anomalies in a system built on pragmatism, not romance. For most, the betrothal marked the beginning of a countdown. The wedding might come within a year or two, time to coincide with the onset of puberty, when the girl's body was deemed ready for childbearing. In modern terms, these were still children. But in ancient Greece, the shift from girl to wife was expected to be abrupt, and the betrothal was the first, irrevocable step. It was the moment when her path narrowed, when the possibility of choice dissolved, and when her identity began to be reshaped, not as a daughter, but as someone else's possession, someone else's investment in the future. When the time came for the wedding, it was not just a family affair, it was a public statement. Marriage in ancient Greece was as much about broadcasting alliances as it was about creating them, and the rituals surrounding it were carefully choreographed to project stability, wealth, and tradition. Yet beneath the garlands and feasting, for the young bride, it was often a bewildering and intimidating leap into an adult world she had not chosen. The preparations began days in advance. Relatives bustled about the household, weaving wreaths of ivy and myrtle, baking honey cakes, and ensuring the dowry was ready to be displayed. The girl herself was treated almost like a ceremonial object, groomed and adorned for presentation. On the eve of the wedding, there was the proalia, a ritual in honor of Artemis, Athena, and Hera. Friends and female kin would gather as the bride offered childhood possessions, dolls, toys, locks of hair, to the goddess, symbolizing the end of her maidenhood. These offerings were both poignant and cruel, marking an abrupt farewell to a childhood that had barely begun. On the wedding day, the house filled with the scent of incense and the sound of flutes. The bride was bathed, often with water drawn from a sacred spring, and her hair was elaborately styled and veiled. A richly embroidered tunic might be draped over her small frame, its folds heavy with symbolism. The fabrics weave represented the interlacing of two families, while the belt, tied tightly around her waist, was both a marker of modesty and a silent hint toward fertility. The ceremony was presided over by men, the curios giving her away, the groom receiving her. In Athens, there was no elaborate exchange of vows. The essence of the marriage was a contract, witnessed and agreed upon. The groom promised to care for the bride and produce legitimate heirs. The bride, for her part, was expected to bring honor, obedience, and children to the household. Perhaps the most unsettling part for a young girl was the anacalypterion, the moment when the groom lifted her veil before the assembled guests. This act was symbolic of his new authority over her, but for a bride who may have only glimpsed her husband briefly, or never at all, it could be a moment of intense anxiety. After the formalities came the procession, the ectasis. At nightfall, the bride was escorted from her father's home to her husband's, often in a cart or chariot, accompanied by torchbearers, musicians, and chanting relatives. Neighbors would watch from doorways as the child, swaddled in fine fabric, was paraded through the streets toward a household she would now be expected to run. The air was filled with a strange mix of celebration and foreboding, the laughter and songs masking the reality that this was not a journey she could turn back from. Upon arrival, the door was sprinkled with nuts and dried fruits, symbols of fertility. The bride and groom were led to the thalamus, the bridal chamber. Here, the rituals ended and the reality of marriage began. For a girl of 13, or sometimes younger, this first night was less about romance than about consummation, a duty tied directly to producing heirs. In the eyes of society, this was her true transformation into a wife. The following day, there was the Apollia, a celebration hosted by the groom's family, with gifts given to the bride. These might include household items, a loom, cooking vessels, fine fabrics, practical tools for her new role as mistress of the house. Yet every gift was also a reminder of the life now expected of her, managing servants, raising children, and maintaining the family's reputation. For the young bride, the wedding marked the abrupt end of whatever sense of self she had developed in her father's home. She was now under the control of her husband, and in most cases, the household was not a partnership but a hierarchy, with the groom's authority absolute. If she faltered in her duties, or if she failed to bear children, her position could become precarious, divorce was possible, and always at the husband's discretion. To the onlookers, the wedding was a triumph of tradition, an affirmation of social order. But for the child at the center of it, it was a rupture, a forced metamorphosis from girl to woman in the space of a single night, one from which there was no return. Once the wedding festivities ended, the new bride's life narrowed dramatically. In her father's home, she may have been able to move about freely, helping in the courtyard, playing with siblings, or running small errands under the watch of older women. But in her husband's household, the rules were different. She was now expected to live in the gyneconitis, the women's quarters, a segregated part of the home reserved for female family members, servants, and children. This was not just a room, it was a form of confinement. The gyneconitis was usually tucked away on an upper floor or deep inside the house, away from the street, with limited access to the central courtyard where men received guests. The architecture itself symbolized the boundaries placed upon her life. Her movements outside these walls were strictly controlled and often required permission from her husband. For many young brides, this meant a sudden and permanent sense of isolation. Her days became a quiet routine of domestic labor. She supervised female slaves, wove cloth on the loom, mended clothing, and oversaw food preparation. The loom, in particular, was not just a household necessity but also a powerful cultural symbol of womanhood in Greece. The endless weaving was a metaphor for a wife's steady, silent contribution to the household, a work that bound her to her place, literally and figuratively. Conversations with other women were limited to those within the household, usually older female relatives or servants. Visits to her natal family were rare and usually occurred only during major festivals or rituals, always with her husband's approval. Friendships outside the family network were almost impossible to maintain. For a girl who had once played in open courtyards or roamed the neighborhood with other children, this sudden enclosure could feel like a slow suffocation. The restrictions weren't just physical, they were also behavioral. A wife's reputation was directly tied to her husband's honor, and any hint of impropriety could bring scandal. Gossip, even unfounded, was dangerous. A woman who was seen speaking too freely to a man outside her family could face accusations of infidelity. In such cases, the punishment was severe and swift, ranging from divorce to public disgrace, and the consequences would follow her for life. The young bride's education, if she had received any before marriage, was also redirected. While boys were trained in rhetoric, politics, and warfare, a wife's learning was often limited to household management, religious rituals, and skills that directly served her husband's estate. If she had been literate, her reading material was carefully controlled, often limited to moral instruction or religious poetry. The emotional toll of this life was profound. Some women adapted by pouring their energy into raising children, finding purpose in motherhood. Others found solace in religious devotion, making offerings to goddesses like Hera or Demeter, or participating in all-female festivals such as the Thesmophoria. These brief moments of collective ritual were among the few occasions when a woman could step outside her domestic walls and reconnect with the broader community of women. But for many, especially young girls married before they had developed a strong sense of self, the isolation deepened their vulnerability. Their world shrank to the rhythms of household chores, the demands of a husband they barely knew, and the quiet pressure to bear healthy children as quickly as possible. Any failure, whether in fertility, obedience, or domestic skill, could lead to shame, neglect, or even being sent back to their family in disgrace. In this way, the marriage bond that was celebrated so lavishly in public often became, in private, a quiet cage, one that few could escape and even fewer dared to challenge. For a young bride in ancient Greece, the true test of her worth in her new household began not with her marriage, but with her ability to produce children, especially sons. The expectation was immediate. Within months of the wedding, her body was scrutinized for signs of pregnancy, and whispered judgments followed if her belly remained flat too long. In the eyes of her husband's family, she was not just a wife, she was a vessel for the continuation of the oikos, the household lineage. But pregnancy in ancient Greece was far from a joyful, safe experience. Medical knowledge was limited, and much of it was steeped in superstition. The leading physicians of the time, like Hippocrates, offered advice that could range from practical to dangerously misguided. Some believed a woman's womb could wander inside her body, causing illness if not anchored by sexual activity and childbearing. The cultural prescription was clear: she should conceive as soon as possible, and as often as possible. The physical risks were immense. There were no antiseptics, no understanding of infection, and very little pain management. Midwives, often older women from the community, were skilled in assisting births, but even they could do little in cases of prolonged labor, breech positions, or hemorrhage. Many young mothers died in childbirth, and many infants did not survive their first year. The surviving records, from grave inscriptions to tragic plays, speak of the heartbreak of women who died in the flower of their youth during delivery. The mental burden was just as heavy. A young wife, often still a teenager, might face the ordeal of labor with no mother or sisters nearby, only the women of her husband's household, whose loyalties might not be entirely her own. If the child was a girl, her joy might be met with disappointment from her husband and in-laws. A male heir was the true prize, and producing one could elevate her standing in the family. Failing to do so, especially after multiple births, could put her in a precarious position. In some cases, the pressure to bear sons was so intense that infant girls were subjected to exposure, being left outside the city walls to die of cold or hunger. This brutal practice was not universal, but it was legal and socially accepted in certain circumstances, often decided by the father alone. For a new mother who had just endured the agony of childbirth, this could be an unbearable cruelty, yet she had little or no say in the matter. The cycle of pregnancy and childbirth was relentless. With no reliable methods of contraception and limited understanding of reproductive health, women could spend most of their short lives either carrying a child, recovering from birth, or preparing for the next pregnancy. Malnutrition, repeated pregnancies, and the toll of labor aged many women prematurely, their youth slipping away before they reached their mid-20s. Religion offered some comfort. Many pregnant women prayed to Aletheia, the goddess of childbirth, leaving offerings in her shrines in hopes of a safe delivery. Charms, amulets, and whispered incantations were also common, blending faith and folk magic in the desperate fight against death in the birthing room. Still, for all the prayers and rituals, survival often came down to luck, and luck was cruelly selective. For the young girls who entered marriage with dreams shaped by family pride or festival songs, the reality of motherhood in ancient Greece was both sacred and deadly, a duty that could bring honor and love, but also suffering, loss, and an early grave. In ancient Greece, the cries of a newborn did not always mean joy. For young mothers, many still in their teens, the moment after birth could hold an unspoken dread. Before the child was fully welcomed into the household, there was a decision to be made, and that decision belonged entirely to the father. If the baby was deemed weak, malformed, or simply the wrong sex, the father could refuse to raise it. This refusal meant the child would be exposed, abandoned in the wilderness, left on a hillside, at the edge of a road, or near a city dump. The word used was ekthesis, a practice so common it was discussed in legal codes, philosophical writings, and even casual letters. It was not considered murder by the law, it was simply a choice about household resources. Girls were more likely to be abandoned than boys. In a society where men inherited land, managed property, and fought in wars, daughters were seen as financial burdens, needing a dowry to marry and offering no direct contribution to the family's wealth or political influence. Even healthy girls could be discarded simply because the household already had too many. For the young mother, this could be an unbearable act. She had no legal authority to intervene. If she protested, she risked angering her husband and jeopardizing her place in the household. Many women were forced to hand over their newborns to servants or midwives, who carried them away in silence. The fate of exposed infants was grim. Most died within hours or days from cold, hunger, or animals. A few were found and taken in, not out of mercy, but to be raised as slaves or prostitutes. Archaeological evidence from ancient cemeteries shows unusually high numbers of infant remains, some with signs of deliberate abandonment. This constant shadow of loss shaped the way mothers bonded with their newborns. Some scholars believe women in ancient Greece may have held back their emotional attachment until a child had survived the first days or even weeks. Religious rituals reflected this caution. The amphidromia, the ceremony that officially welcomed a child into the household, often happened several days after birth, once survival seemed more certain. Still, love could not always be restrained. Some mothers smuggled food to abandoned babies, or arranged for a friend or relative in another village to secretly take them in. These small acts of defiance left no official record, but they echo faintly in plays and myths, stories where children thought lost are miraculously found and restored to their birth families. For the young women of ancient Greece, the pain of infant mortality and exposure was not a rare tragedy, it was a woven thread in daily life. Motherhood could bring pride, but it also meant living with the knowledge that every pregnancy might end in silence, either through nature's cruelty or the cold decision of a household's patriarch. For most young girls in ancient Greece, the mind was considered far less important than the womb. Education, in the formal sense, was not part of their destiny. In Athens, the birthplace of democracy and philosophy, girls rarely stepped into a classroom. The ideals of Socrates and Plato were for the ears of boys. The daughters of the household were expected to learn something entirely different: obedience, modesty, and the skills to manage domestic life. From an early age, a girl's curriculum consisted of spinning wool, weaving, cooking, and perhaps playing the lyre, not for artistic development, but to entertain the household. Reading and writing were often deemed unnecessary, though wealthier families sometimes allowed their daughters to learn basic literacy at home, taught by a tutor or by their own mother if she had been fortunate enough to acquire it. But even in these rare cases, education was not a gateway to independence, it was a refinement, like embroidery on a garment, meant to enhance her appeal as a wife, not her autonomy. In stark contrast, boys attended paideia, where they learned literature, rhetoric, philosophy, music, and athletics. They were groomed to be citizens, soldiers, or statesmen. Girls, by law and custom, could never become full citizens in Athens, and thus there was no reason, at least in the eyes of society, to teach them the skills of public life. To educate a girl too well was sometimes even considered dangerous. A clever woman could be seen as disobedient or disruptive to the male order. In other Greek city-states, the picture varied. Sparta stands out as an exception. Girls there received physical training alongside boys, running, wrestling, throwing javelins, because strong mothers were believed to produce strong warriors. Spartan girls were also more likely to be literate, as their society valued discipline and a certain level of mental fortitude in both sexes. But this did not mean freedom. Spartan women still had no say in political matters, and their primary role remained that of wife and mother to soldiers. For the majority outside of Sparta, intellectual starvation was the norm. Girls were often shielded from philosophical discussions, history, and political news. When great plays by Sophocles or Euripides were performed, they might hear them only through the accounts of male relatives, or not at all. The knowledge that circulated within the gyneconitis, the women's quarters, was practical, passed down in whispers and demonstrations: how to bake bread, how to soothe a crying baby, how to keep household accounts, and how to avoid angering a husband. This systematic denial of education was not simply neglect, it was a form of control. To keep women ignorant was to ensure they could not participate in, question, or challenge the structures that ruled their lives. And for the young girls growing up within this system, the boundaries of the known world were drawn by the walls of their homes. Even those rare women who broke the pattern, like the poet Sappho of Lesbos, existed as exceptions that proved the rule. Sappho's lyrical voice reached across the centuries, but her life reminds us that only a tiny fraction of Greek women had the chance to cultivate their intellects, and fewer still were remembered for it. For most, the mind's hunger was a quiet ache, easily buried under the daily demands of domestic life. But it was there, an unspoken longing that perhaps some women passed on to their daughters, an inheritance of curiosity in a world determined to deny it. In ancient Greece, a girl's journey into motherhood often began not in her 20s, but in her early teens, sometimes as soon as her body showed the first signs of maturity. Marriage contracts could be arranged when she was barely 12, and consummation followed soon after, regardless of her readiness. By modern standards, these girls were still children themselves, yet in the eyes of their society, they had already reached their purpose. The dangers were immense. Ancient medicine had little understanding of reproductive health, and childbirth was a leading cause of death for young women. A girl whose bones were not yet fully developed faced higher risks of obstructed labor, hemorrhage, and infection. Even the wealthiest families, with access to trained midwives, could not escape these dangers. Complications that are treatable today were often fatal then. The cultural expectation was clear: a young wife was to produce heirs quickly. If the first child was a girl, pressure to continue bearing children intensified until a son was born. Each pregnancy brought the same dangers, with little recovery time in between. Malnutrition, physical exhaustion, and repeated childbirth could leave women permanently weakened or infertile by their 20s. And there was the emotional toll. Many of these young mothers had no choice in whom they married, no voice in when they conceived, and no say in the fate of their children. They were expected to endure miscarriages, stillbirths, and infant deaths with stoic acceptance. Public mourning was discouraged. Grief, like childbirth, was treated as a private matter, best kept within the walls of the oikos, household. In wealthier homes, a nurse or wet nurse might be hired to care for the baby, which spared the mother some physical strain but often at the cost of emotional connection. In poorer households, the mother had no such help, tending to the child herself while managing all the domestic labor expected of her. The strain could be relentless: washing clothes, grinding grain, fetching water, and preparing meals while nursing or tending to a sick infant. Religious rituals attempted to frame motherhood as a sacred duty. Offerings to Artemis, protector of women in childbirth, were common, as were prayers to Aletheia, the goddess of labor. But for the young mother, faith was no shield from the physical agony of a prolonged labor or the quiet terror that her child, or she herself, might not survive the night. What's striking is how normalized this suffering was. Philosophers might speak of the beauty of a woman's role in creating life, poets might praise the virtues of motherhood, but neither acknowledged the visceral, everyday reality of danger and loss. Girls were taught to see it as inevitable, part of the natural order. And so, generation after generation, the cycle continued, children giving birth to children, their futures swallowed by the demands of survival in a world where their bodies were both their greatest value and their greatest vulnerability. For young girls in ancient Greece, marriage did not simply mean becoming a wife, it meant stepping into a lifetime of unpaid, unacknowledged labor. From the moment a girl crossed the threshold into her husband's household, she was expected to transform into the silent engine of its daily functioning. The oikos, or household, was the basic unit of Greek society, and women were its hidden machinery. In Athens, the ideal wife was praised not for beauty or wit, but for her skill in managing domestic affairs. This management was all-encompassing. She oversaw the preparation of food, often grinding grain by hand, a task that could take hours each morning. She kept track of stores of oil, wine, and grain, ensured that clothing and linens were washed and repaired, and coordinated the work of any slaves or servants, if the family could afford them. The wife's role was so central that Xenophon, in his Economicus, compared her to the captain of a ship, steering the home through the storms of daily life. But unlike a captain, she had no public recognition. Her work was invisible, its value measured only in the smooth running of the household and the absence of complaint from her husband. There was no payment, no respite, and no concept of time off. Illness did not excuse her from her duties, the rhythms of domestic labor pressed on, season after season. For poorer women, the burden was heavier still. Without servants, every chore fell to the wife herself, hauling water from a well, gathering firewood, weaving every piece of clothing, and tending the small garden that supplemented the family's diet. These tasks were physically exhausting, and the repetitive motions, bending, lifting, kneading, left many women with chronic pain before they were 30. Girls learned this life from their mothers long before they entered it. In their natal homes, they were trained in the tasks that would define their futures. A child of 6 might already be winding yarn for weaving. By 10, she could be baking bread or helping prepare meals for a feast. This was not framed as labor, but as duty, part of her moral training. A girl who shirked her tasks risked shame, gossip, and the loss of her reputation as a good future wife. This labor was also bound up with the strict segregation of gendered spaces. In many Athenian homes, women lived and worked in the gynekonitis, the women's quarters, often on the upper floor. Here, they spent their days largely apart from the male members of the household, except during meals or family ceremonies. The separation reinforced the idea that women belonged to a private, unseen world, while men operated in the public sphere. Even in leisure, a woman's hands were rarely idle. Social visits with other women often doubled as working sessions, spinning wool together, sharing recipes, or exchanging tips on managing servants. These gatherings could be moments of solidarity, but they also reinforced the reality that women's value lay in their ability to labor quietly and without complaint. Religious festivals offered rare moments of respite, but even these were often tied to domestic roles. The Thesmophoria, a women-only festival honoring Demeter, involved rituals connected to fertility and the agricultural cycle, work of a different kind, but still labor in the service of sustaining the household and the city. The truth is that without the ceaseless, uncredited work of women, Greek society would have collapsed. Yet, because this work was hidden, it was undervalued. Men built monuments, fought wars, and debated in the assembly. Women kept them alive and clothed to do so. The young girls who entered this life stepped into a cycle that was as rigid as it was necessary, a cycle designed to keep them indispensable and invisible. For a young girl in ancient Greece, the culmination of her marital duty, and in many ways the entire justification for her existence in the eyes of her society, was motherhood. But this role, so glorified in poetry and religious imagery, came with dangers that were as brutal as they were unavoidable. Childbearing was a gamble with a woman's life. Without the benefits of modern medicine, even a healthy young woman faced high risks during pregnancy and delivery. Infections, hemorrhage, obstructed labor, these could strike swiftly, and there was no reliable intervention beyond the skill of midwives and the aid of the gods. Archaeological evidence from ancient Greek cemeteries shows a sharp spike in female mortality between the ages of 15 and 30, the prime childbearing years. A girl might survive her first pregnancy only to face the same hazards again within a year or two. The ordeal began early. Many girls were married at 13 or 14, and pregnancy often followed quickly. Their bodies were not always ready to bear children. Immature pelvic bones could make labor excruciating and more likely to end in tragedy. The emotional toll was equally severe. These were still children themselves, tasked with bringing forth and caring for other children, often without a deep understanding of the process or the risks. If a woman survived childbirth, the next challenge was infant mortality. In some Greek city-states, as many as 1 in 3 babies did not survive their first year. Diseases, malnutrition, and accidents were constant threats. Mothers bore the grief of repeated loss, sometimes burying several infants before raising one to adulthood. While men could remarry and father more children, a woman's social value could plummet if she was unable to produce surviving heirs. Breastfeeding was expected of most mothers, though wealthier women sometimes employed wet nurses, often slaves, to take on this physically demanding task. Breastfeeding tied a mother to her child day and night, limiting her mobility and consuming much of her energy. For poorer women, it was only one of many tasks she juggled while managing the household. The act of giving birth was also steeped in religious and superstitious practices. Women called upon Artemis, goddess of childbirth, for protection, offering small votive figurines or dedicating locks of hair at her shrines. Yet there was an unspoken fear in these prayers. Artemis was also associated with sudden death, and her favor could turn as quickly as it was sought. Motherhood did not shield women from further hardships. A wife's failure to produce male heirs could justify her husband's decision to take another woman, whether as a concubine or through divorce. This placed enormous pressure on young mothers to bear sons. Daughters were valuable in arranging alliances through marriage, but it was sons who carried on the family name and inherited property. Even when surrounded by children, a woman could be painfully isolated. She had little say in how her children were raised beyond the domestic sphere. Boys would be sent to the male spaces of education and training, while daughters were trained to replicate their mother's life of seclusion and service. This cycle began anew with each generation, unbroken for centuries. For ancient Greek girls, the promise of motherhood was a double-edged sword. It was the one role that offered a sense of purpose within their society, yet it was also the most dangerous and demanding path they could walk. Every pregnancy was both a potential triumph and a looming threat. Survival, in many cases, was as much a matter of fortune as it was of strength. Beneath the marble temples and poetic ideals of ancient Greece lay a grim reality few modern romanticizations dare to address: the fate of unwanted children. For young mothers, especially those still in their teens, bearing a child did not guarantee that child would be welcomed into the world. Poverty, shame, disability, or simply the absence of a male heir could seal an infant's fate within days of birth. Infanticide and child abandonment were not hidden crimes in much of the ancient Greek world. They were socially and, in many cases, legally accepted practices. The father, as head of the oikos, held ultimate authority to decide whether a newborn would be raised. Upon the infant's birth, the midwife would present the child to the father. If he lifted the baby into his arms, it was accepted into the family. If he turned away, the child might be left to die or exposed outside the home. Exposure, apotheosis, was the most common method. The infant would be placed in a basket or swaddling cloth and left in a remote area, at the edge of a city, on a hillside, or beside a riverbank. This could be done discreetly under the cover of night, with the chilling understanding that nature, animals, or starvation would finish the act. In some cases, infants were left in places where passers-by might take them in, but this was far from a guarantee of survival. Many who were rescued ended up as slaves or beggars. The reasons were often brutally pragmatic. Girls were abandoned far more often than boys because they were seen as economic burdens. A dowry had to be paid to marry them off, and they could not inherit in most city-states. In rural communities struggling to survive, one extra mouth could mean hunger for the rest of the family. Deformed or sickly babies were also rejected, as were those born from illicit unions that could bring scandal upon the household. For the young mothers themselves, the act could be emotionally devastating, but their voice rarely mattered. In patriarchal Athens, for instance, the decision was entirely the husband's. Even in Sparta, where women held more social influence, weak or unfit infants were systematically culled in the name of preserving military strength. Religion both sanctioned and soothed the act. Some believed that leaving an infant outdoors returned the child to the gods, allowing the divine to decide its fate. Others made small offerings to deities like Hermes or Hecate when abandoning a child, as if to ask for safe passage to the underworld. But these rituals did little to ease the cruelty of the act. The psychological weight of abandonment lingered. Stories from Greek drama, like Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, drew on this societal reality to explore fate, shame, and survival. Behind the myth was a stark truth: countless real children never made it past their first days, and countless young mothers carried silent grief for lives they could not protect. In the public eye, such practices were framed as practical necessity. In private, they were wounds that cut deep, scars carried by women whose own youth had been stolen by a society that expected them to bear children, yet gave them little power over whether those children lived. In the bustling agoras of Athens or the great port of Piraeus, alongside stalls selling olive oil, pottery, and fine cloth, there were other wares on display: human lives. Among them, the youngest and most vulnerable were girls, bought and sold like livestock, their worth measured not by their humanity but by the utility their bodies could provide. The ancient Greek world thrived on slavery. It was the backbone of households, farms, workshops, and ships. But the trade in girls carried a particularly grim dimension, for many were destined not for manual labor but for domestic servitude, concubinage, or prostitution. War was a major source of this human supply chain. When city-states clashed, the defeated often paid the price not just in territory or treasure but in their people. In the aftermath of battle, soldiers would sweep through towns, seizing women and children as part of the spoils. Young girls, with their perceived docility and longer potential service years, fetched high prices. Some were sold into the homes of wealthy families, where they might serve as attendants, handmaids, or nursemaids. Outwardly, such positions could appear safe compared to grueling agricultural labor. In reality, these roles placed them in constant proximity to their masters, leaving them vulnerable to harassment and abuse with no recourse. The legal system offered no protection; slaves were property, not persons. Others entered the shadowy realm of pornai, brothels sanctioned by the state and taxed for revenue. The youngest girls might be hidden away until they matured physically, but there were always those willing to pay for novelty, and the boundaries between law and exploitation blurred easily when profit was involved. These establishments were often overseen by a pornoboscos, pimp, who viewed the girls purely as investments, their bodies a means of generating income until they were too worn or ill to work. For those taken into traveling troupes of entertainers, dancers, musicians, acrobats, their lives were no less precarious. While some became celebrated for their talents, most were expected to please audiences in ways that extended far beyond the stage. In such cases, music and dance were only the veneer of a far more transactional existence. The tragedy was compounded for girls taken at an age when they barely understood the meaning of enslavement. Torn from their families, they were thrust into a world where language, customs, and faces were unfamiliar. Many never saw their homes again. Even those who managed to earn or be granted freedom often found themselves without kin, dowry, or social standing, unable to marry respectably or secure stable work. The buying and selling of young girls was not viewed as a moral failing in Greek society; it was an accepted, regulated part of the economy. Philosophers debated the ethics of slavery in abstract terms, but rarely addressed the lived horrors of those trapped within it. The result was a quiet, enduring exploitation, hidden behind the grandeur of temples and the elegance of marble statues, where the suffering of the powerless went unrecorded except in the faint, passing shadows of history. For some girls in ancient Greece, the path to womanhood was not marked by marriage or servitude but by a life set apart, one dedicated to the gods. On the surface, this might seem like a place of honor, a refuge from the dangers of the outside world. But for many, religious service carried its own form of captivity, isolation, and sacrifice. In certain city-states, girls could be dedicated to temples as part of family vows, repayment for divine favor, or as an offering to secure good fortune. Some were given in thanks for healing, others as atonement for transgressions, real or imagined. Once chosen, their lives no longer belonged to them. They became part of the sacred household, subject to the will of priests, priestesses, and the strict rhythms of ritual life. The roles varied depending on the deity. Serving Artemis might mean years spent in the Arctia, a rite in which young girls, called little bears, performed dances, chants, and symbolic acts in the goddess's honor. These rites could involve lengthy periods of separation from family, strict dietary controls, and the prohibition of contact with men. For goddesses like Athena or Demeter, temple maidens were tasked with maintaining sacred fires, weaving ceremonial garments, and preparing offerings in an unbroken cycle of devotion. While some duties were relatively benign, others demanded intense physical and emotional endurance. Ritual purification might involve cold water immersions at dawn, fasting for days, or sleepless nights spent chanting. In certain mystery cults, whose rites remain partly hidden from historians, initiates endured symbolic acts of death and rebirth, which could be frightening for the very young. There was also the unspoken danger of being placed under the authority of powerful men within the temple hierarchy. While religious sanctuaries were meant to be safe havens, they were not immune to exploitation. A girl's sacred status did not always protect her from being used as a political pawn or from being coerced into rituals that blurred the line between devotion and abuse. For some, temple service was lifelong, meaning they would never marry, bear children, or own property. For others, it ended when they reached marriageable age, but reintegration into ordinary life was not always smooth. Years of separation from family and community could make them strangers in their own homes, and their futures often depended on whether their time in the temple was considered an honor or a stigma. Yet within this system, there were rare cases where religious life offered a measure of empowerment. A few priestesses held real influence, managing temple wealth, interpreting omens, and advising leaders. But these were exceptions, reserved for women of elite birth. The majority of girls served silently, their labor and devotion absorbed into the grandeur of the gods, their personal desires sacrificed on the altar of tradition. In the public festivals, crowds would watch these girls in processions, crowned with garlands, their white robes gleaming under the sun. To onlookers, they appeared blessed. But behind the ritual smiles were lives shaped by choices they had never made, young hearts caught between reverence and resignation, their futures dictated not by fate, but by the demands of those who claimed to speak for the divine. When we look back at the lives of young girls in ancient Greece, we often find their voices missing entirely. The records that survive, laws, philosophical treatises, plays, and household manuals, were almost exclusively written by men. Women's words, and especially those of girls, were rarely deemed worthy of preservation. Their stories survive only in fragments, a passing mention in a court record, a name etched on a tombstone, a line in a poem meant to praise someone else. This absence is itself a form of historical violence. It means that the realities of their daily lives, the quiet resilience, the private griefs, the stolen moments of joy, are left to be guessed at, pieced together from the perspectives of those who controlled their fates. We know far more about how men thought women should live than how women themselves experienced it. Still, in the shadows of history, there are glimpses. Archaeological finds, simple jewelry, children's toys, weeding tools, hint at the worlds these girls inhabited. A terracotta figurine might show a young girl playing with a pet bird. A painted vase might depict her carrying water from the fountain, chatting with a friend. These images, though created by male artisans, offer flashes of individuality, moments not entirely swallowed by the weight of cultural expectation. Yet the silence is telling. In literature, girls were often symbolic rather than human, a maiden to be rescued, a daughter to be married off, a sacrifice to appease the gods. Their inner thoughts were irrelevant to the narrative. In legal contexts, they were property, belonging first to their fathers, then to their husbands. Their testimony carried little weight, their rights existed only in relation to the men in their lives, and their value was measured in terms of fertility, obedience, and family honor. The result was a system that made forgetting easy. Without the written word to preserve their personal histories, these girls faded quickly from collective memory. The struggles of one generation were repeated in the next, each believing it to be the natural order of things. Even the most horrific aspects, the arranged marriages to much older men, the dangers of childbirth at 13, the lack of bodily autonomy, were normalized through repetition. And so the legacy of silence became self-perpetuating. Centuries later, we are left with only traces, trying to reconstruct lives from the margins of history. Every scrap of evidence, every burial, every household item, every line of poetry becomes precious, a clue to understanding the human cost of a society that prized its philosophers, warriors, and statesmen, yet saw little need to preserve the thoughts of half its population. Perhaps the most haunting realization is this: the girls of ancient Greece lived through these hardships knowing that their stories would likely never be told. Their joys and sorrows, their moments of rebellion or resignation, would vanish with them. And yet, in small acts, a whispered joke between friends, a stolen hour at the fountain, a quiet prayer to a goddess for strength, they carved out spaces of humanity in a world that so often denied it to them. Now, centuries later, giving voice to those silenced lives is not just an act of historical curiosity. It is an act of justice. To remember them is to challenge the idea that their suffering was inevitable. To speak their names, even when they are lost to us, is to remind ourselves that they mattered, that they were more than the roles imposed upon them.